Actually, why don't you call it still more about Lahiri?
Still more.
Because it isn't really even more. There's a slight nuance of difference there in the meaning, and so I'd rather have it be still more. I thought about that overnight.
Yeah, sure. Did you get your cough drops?
I didn't. I'm not as well prepared, but I'm good enough.
Okay.
Thank you for asking. Okay, anytime. Okay. Is my neckline?
Yes.
Okay.
That's good.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing our discussion of the masters of self-realization of this path. And we're still talking about Lahiri because I just didn't feel yesterday that I was able to say everything I wanted to say. And I don't think we're in a hurry, so we'll just keep going. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahasaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune ourselves to your living presence, that your names become actual vibrations within our hearts, that when we think of you, you come to us, that you guide us and bless us. We are children in this world, and we need the hand of wisdom and love to take us from delusion to enlightenment. Guide us, bless us, bring us into thy eternal freedom. Om. Peace. Amen. There's a book, and I was trying to find the title of it, but I've lost it again. And it was a publication of Lahiri's diaries, which have not really been largely translated into English yet. They're still mostly in Bengali, which was the language he wrote them in. But there is a book that has some of them translated, and it's quite interwoven with the author's own point of view, so it's not a clear-cut book, which is part of the reason that I keep losing track of the title, because it was a frustrating book. But it presented something about Lahiri, which I think is perhaps not as well known, and maybe we should think about it more. This was what I was reflecting on at the end of yesterday. That after Lahiri was initiated by Babaji and he was sent back to Varanasi to continue to live the life that he had been living, going to work, doing volunteer things to make the community better. Also, he was a tutor and a teacher of certain students, young students, children. He raised his family. Master referred to his two saintly sons, Kinkori and Dinkori. So in some way, Lahiri also had a tremendous influence on his children, positive spiritually. Autobiography tells the story of when his wife realized the saintliness of her husband and became his disciples. So you can see in these very familial ways he was radiating his presence. Lahiri never advertised, never talked about, never made an attempt to make known what he was doing. He let the fragrance of the flower attract the honeybees of devotees. He never made an organization of his own or anything like that. And even more interestingly, he had his disciples not talk about their discipleship to him, so that two people could both be disciples of Lahiri and not know it unless they happened to meet, going to the master's house. He had this, even though, and it's a strange paradox when you think about it, even though he was the launching point of this Kriya Yoga, he wanted it to be launched by the deep vibrations of the individuals who are practicing it, and not by any superficial interest on the part of people who didn't have that serious karma. Because now this is sort of the reconciliation of Babaji saying, don't give it to anyone unless they're willing to renounce the world for God, and Lahiri saying, but there are many suffering souls who would benefit. But that didn't translate into what finally happened when Master came to America, and they're putting life-size cardboard images of him on the sidewalk to advertise his talks, and big posters and big billboards. Lahiri was very far from that stage. He went farther than Babaji's first suggestion, but still he kept it, and he kept it very much on the power of the vibration, for people to find that vibration and come. I'm reminded as I think about this that in the beginning years of Ananda, in two ways, Swamiji really kept his consciousness veiled. One of them was the way he took his position within Ananda, and for many years, he especially for the first decade. Let me see, the first decade is the most relevant one. The fact that he was actually the spiritual focal point of Ananda was not obvious if you just came to visit. And even Swami himself, he didn't really want us to talk about it. He didn't want it to become a cultural norm. I remember one woman who had been living there for a year or for a few months, I'm not really sure how long. She came to me and she said, it seems to me that everything that's happening at Ananda is emanating from Swami Kriyananda. And my response, which I remember, was I said, yes, but don't tell anyone. And it wasn't that we never spoke of him in that way, but Swamiji knew it was important that whatever relationship we formed with him, it had to be because there was an intuitive experience of his consciousness, and not because it was what you were supposed to do if you were at Ananda. He didn't want it to be that everybody says so, here comes Swami, oh, I'm having an experience too, which is what happens in spiritual organizations. It was entirely without form and therefore completely sincere. And that's among many things what gave Ananda such a solid foundation, is that whatever you felt from Master, from Swamiji, you really felt it. There was nothing in the atmosphere, in the cultural climate, so to speak. I mean, we had very little form to what we were doing, and we had very little of anything. I mean, we had nothing. So it all had to be inward, because there just wasn't much outward to support it. And in fact, we kind of lamented, some of us lamented, when Ananda began to get more form and there was more there, because then people could come and respond to the there instead of to the inward reality. And it occurred to me when I was thinking about this that that's exactly, I mean, because I lived through that and I understood the power of it, I understand what Lahiri was doing. Because what he was doing was he was beginning the force that was going to bring Kriya into Dwapara Yuga, that was eventually going to send Master from India to America, and then it would come back from America to India. I mean, what we see happening now. Now, in the path, at the end of the path, when Swami's talking about the last days of Master's life, he talks about the power of these great spiritual families. And he talks about how more than presidents and prime ministers and so on, the globe is run by these great spiritual leaders and the great spiritual power that they emanate. And then the family of devotees that builds up around them we're talking over millennia. We're not just talking one generation. And he said these great spiritual figures and their spiritual families make great nations. They band together in great nations, and it's their divine force that is actually directing the course of this planet. Even the presidents and the prime ministers and the legislatures, they're all being they're reflections of the karma of the countries they lead, but that destiny is really being guided from somewhere else. And that power is not worldly power. That power is the power of magnetism and the power of thought and the power of consciousness. This world is an energy universe, and energy is moved by subtle forces. And once the energy is shifted, then it manifests in new ways. It's not changed first by moving the physical objects around. This is a profound misunderstanding that worldly people have. So when Lahiri came, Lahiri was sent by Babaji into Varanasi to return Kriya Yoga to the awareness of people's consciousness, it was not going to be done by advertisements in the newspaper. It was not going to be done by going to the government and getting them to make laws. It was not going to be done by celebrity endorsement. It had to be done by individuals intuitively feeling the call to be guided by God, by their destiny, to find Lahiri and to recognize who he was, and then to devote himself, so that the foundation power of Kriya would not be based on anything external. It would be based entirely and only on the deep experience of individuals who would begin this pulse of energy. Now, in America, we think of this lineage as belonging to Yogananda, because being isolated as we were when Master arrived in 1920, we didn't know Lahiri Mahasaya, we didn't know Sri Yukteswar. Master didn't publish autobiography until 1946. So he was here for 26 years before all those stories were put in front of people. Of course, he must have talked about it. He did talk about it. But what we take for granted is this understanding of where he came from and why he was here was not in common understanding for most of Master's life in this country. So we have a very singular sense of who he is. But Lahiri Mahasaya had many, many, many disciples. And when Swami Kriyananda wants to talk about our Kriya Yoga, he tells the story of how Anandamoyi Ma teased him when he said something, when Swami was trying to explain the practices he does, our Kriya Yoga. And Ma sort of went, our Kriya Yoga. Or I think the word actually Swami said was my Kriya Yoga. And she didn't have to say more than that. She meant, what do you mean? How can you possibly own something like this? And, Swami, they had a very mother-son relationship, and it was a kindly tease because she was correcting him. So Swami always calls it, because it's accurate, the Kriya Yoga of Lahiri Mahasaya, because that's the point where it began from, in this particular expression. But Lahiri had many disciples, and many of those disciples had disciples, because there's no way. Master himself said, excuse me a moment, I have to clear my throat. I have something sticky on my hands too, which keeps my hands keep sticking together, but I'll just have to live with it. Okay. Oh yes, Master talked of himself as being I have to do something for my throat, which is just a little bit more than I can do right now. I was a little careless this morning. A friend sent me some of these nice essential oils, which really are very mentholated. So you're going to watch me just medicate myself right here on that. And say, yeah, that'll do it. You know, all these masks that we have to wear. I'm really sorry for this. All these masks that we have to wear. I made the mistake of putting a mentholated cough drop in my mouth before I put my mask on. And then all of a sudden my eyes are just dripping with tears. I mean, I could suddenly see everybody's glasses fog up. Anyway, coming back to it. Master talked about being the last in this line of gurus, but he can't possibly be the last guru in this line, because if Master were the last soul ever to become a guru, that means that nobody in this line would ever become self-realized. And of course, we have to, because this is what this teaching does for us. And Master Nayaswami writes about this in a very interesting essay somewhere. Master had said that in order to be liberated, you have to liberate 6 others. Now, that doesn't mean you have to bring them to final moksha, because then everybody in the world would have to be liberated at the same time. So that's not what he meant. But Swami said it wasn't clear to him what he meant, but firmly planted on this path at least, and perhaps greatly elevated. When Sister Gyanamata died, Master talked about seeing her merge into the infinite, that she was perfectly free. And when she said that, Swami thought to himself, but I thought you had to have disciples before you could be liberated, because in the context of SRF, with Master there in the ashram, it seemed that Master was the guru. And Swami said he didn't even articulate it, he just thought it. And Master turned to him and said, oh, she had disciples, which is a very interesting statement. Even when Master was there, certain of those disciples, Gyanamata was their conduit. Gyanamata was their necessary link. Now, I don't know how to say this any more clearly or exactly than that, because I don't know. Swami himself said, for most of the people at Ananda, he said, I am their link to Master. Now, again, what exactly does that mean? I really don't know. But even like St. Francis, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, St. Teresa of Avila, Padre Pio, their devotion was to Christ, and the power that came to them came through Christ, but they also had spiritual responsibility. That were the words that Swami also used with me once. He said, Master said to him that he would be more than a teacher, that he would have spiritual responsibility for people. I can't draw that to a finer focus. I find it interesting to contemplate. I certainly know that what I know of Master came through Swami, and what Swamiji taught me was how to be in tune with Master. So how do you parse that apart? I really can't. But therefore, even though Master was the last in the line, and it went from Lahiri to Sri Yukteswar to Paramhansa Yogananda into the United States, and then all over the world, Lahiri had many other disciples. None of them are formally part of that line, but many of them would have been gurus in their own right, because they would have attained self-realization, or at least some of them, or become highly advanced. You can become highly advanced in your relationship. Your spiritual responsibility for others begins to develop. I also asked Swami that same question. Swamiji, long before one's destined guru is himself self-realized, the relationship must be building. So it can't be that you just you never meet this person until suddenly they appear as a Satguru, and then suddenly they're Satguru. The relationship must have been building over many, many incarnations. You're finding your 6 or your 7,000 or whatever it is, depending how powerful you are. And Swami just said, well, of course that's true. So the end point, and that was a long diversion, which is why probably tomorrow's still on Lahiri, but let's keep going, is that the Kriya of Lahiri Mahasaya does not belong to Paramhansa Yogananda, nor does it belong to any organization. It was the beginning of this banyan tree, this enormous banyan tree, which can trace its root back to a starting trunk. But the branches of the banyan tree grow out like that, and then they come down to the ground, and then they come up again. So you can have, Swamiji said, you can have a banyan tree that covers a whole acre that all begins from a single trunk. And so the Kriya of Lahiri Mahasaya is what he learned from Babaji and what he spread through India mostly, but really throughout all the world. And he started it, coming back to all of this, he started it with very little external form to it, because it had to be the power of direct experience. So Lahiri, especially after he retired from his job, which he did after a time, he then just sat in the living room of his house. And now I'm going to go back to his house. We enter through that you come down this narrow lane, you see a very ordinary wooden door. You step inside of it, and like many Indian houses, it's built around a courtyard. So the courtyard's here, and the house goes up a couple of stories. It's not that large, as I was saying. The courtyard is just like the size of a living room. And then the room where Lahiri would sit, I go like this, I think it was in the back corner here. And there was a doorway that led directly onto the courtyard, and you could look into the room. It was a small room. I believe I said this earlier, the size of a comfortable bedroom size. So we have this picture of this, worldwide mission beginning from this great master. And because we're coming out of Kali Yuga, and to a certain extent, if you're an American, you tend to think, better is bigger. And you just sort of imagine something like, the Empire State Building or something like that to launch this. And there's also the story of Lahiri sitting on the balcony and expounding the Gita. And the balcony is a very small balcony. It's just, like the balcony off of a small room. Swami, I was not able to stand on it. I only looked at it when Swami was there in the late 50s and early 60s. He was allowed through the whole house at that point. And he said the balcony would hold 8 or 10 people at the most. And then Lahiri would expound on the Gita, or he would inspire his disciples to speak his thoughts on his behalf. It's just all of it is very, very different than we imagine it to be. And Lahiri told people to be private, completely private about their meditation practice. By the time we got there, those admonitions were carried to ridiculous extremes by the elderly man who had control of the house. We were literally not allowed to meditate. We were not allowed to close our eyes because Lahiri had said you should meditate in private. So we visited that house a number of times, and we developed a certain technique of several of us would surround the host and try to maneuver him into sort of a corner of the courtyard, and then ply him with questions so that other people could actually close their eyes. He would still watch. I mean, Mamma Mia, if people's relatives are not necessarily the ones who carry it on. But anyway, that's what we were working with. Now, coming back to it, we tend to think of Lahiri's contribution to our path, and it's very valid, was that you could live an ordinary life and be an extraordinary devotee. Because there's this inclination that people have that they have to make their lives dramatically different. And the first thing that people think of sometimes when they get on the path is, I'm going to leave my family and quit my job. Just sort of because I want to be a devotee. I want to create a form that looks like a devotee. And we think the more radical, the better, because the romantic radical gesture is far more attractive than the actual fact of the spiritual path, because the spiritual path is one foot in front of the other through a lot of really dull scenery. And it's just entirely different. So we want to be Trey, like this, to show our dedication, because the sort of solid, constant, unrelenting perseverance that is what the spiritual path really is not nearly as romantic or as exciting. So what Lahiri establishes on the first hand for us is that it is what you are inside, not who you appear to be on the outside. And so that is how we tend to think about him. But what Lahiri actually did was meditate. And that was what his picture of a devotee was. He meditated. He also raised a family. He also did work, but especially after he retired. But even still, his message, and now this is so obvious, his message was Kriya Yoga. Now, but all the Guru's messages was Kriya Yoga, but more than any of the other masters, Lahiri lived the meditative life. And back at the beginning of this, I made reference to this diary that Lahiri kept, and it hasn't been fully translated into English, although it could be, at least as far as I know. Now, again, from my perspective, and when the ant sits at the base of the Himalayas, it can really only sort of point out the biggest landmarks. It's not like the ant, which is me, sitting at the base of the Himalayas, really has any idea what the top of the mountain is. So this is the ant speculating about these things. There's this thought in our minds, in my mind, that there's some kind of like end point. You know, you achieve God, you reach Nirvikalpa Samadhi, you reach Sabbakalpa Samadhi, whatever it might be. But I was very intrigued in a letter that Master wrote to Rajasi. There's this collection of letters which unfortunately was not given to Ananda. It was given to someone else, and they haven't published it like we would have published it. But these letters that Master wrote to Rajasi and Rajasi wrote to Master. And in one of them, Master is suggesting to Rajasi various things he could try when he's meditating, various sort of interesting little adventures he could have, and ways he could relate to Divine Mother, and questions he could ask of the infinite, perhaps have answered. In the end of Master's life in 1948, just before Swami came, it was August, I believe. Swami came in September. Master had a famous, I would use the word famous, like 3-day samadhi in Durga Mata's book, Trilogy of Divine Love, I think it's called. She describes what that was like. Master was in this exalted state for 3 days and nights, and the nuns and others took turns sort of sitting in a closet so as not to disturb him, but taking notes because he was talking. And he in that vision, he talked to Divine Mother, and then in his own voice would speak what Divine Mother was speaking. And one of the things, one of the exchanges in that was Divine Mother taking him around creation and revealing some of her secrets. And there was actually a little exchange between Master and Divine Mother where Master says, "Oh, that's how you do it." It's like you stop and you think, what could they have been, what could have been going on that would cause a remark like that? So in this letter from Master to Rajasi, he makes some suggestions about various kinds of ways of meditating, as I recall, in regard to Divine Mother, in regard to creation, things that he might enjoy. So all of a sudden, my whole picture of reality, which of course is the ant sitting next to Mount Everest, it breaks into even, more and different fragments. So Lahiri Mahasaya is there meditating, and he's keeping a diary of his meditation experiences. At least this is what I understand from this fragment of a book that I've seen. Just talking about different experiences, talking about different ways to meditate, experimenting with different things that you can do when you're in those high states of consciousness, including um, speculation about whether animals could be liberated directly instead of having to go through all of the stages of human life. I, I have no idea where to put any of these things, but Lahiri was very busy. He was very busy um, exploring these inner realms, and apparently keeping some kind of a chronicle of them. Now, again, I'm a little outside my field of expertise, but this is what I understand from the bit of it that has been published so far, and what the rest of it is, I don't know. So here's the interesting part on this. At the beginning of Ananda, and tomorrow is going to be even still more about about Lahiri. At the beginning of Ananda, we had to work. We worked very, very hard because we had to survive. We had to generate enough to make things happen. Plus, we needed to work. We had a lot of karma to work out and a lot of restlessness to get rid of and various things. So we worked many hours and very hard all the time. And somebody came to Swami with, some book with master's words in it. And its master said, the ideal life for the yogi is to meditate 3 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the evening, and in between do a little God reminding work. I mean, maybe it wasn't quite like that, but it was real close to it. And they brought it to Swami. Now, remember, I talked about how Swami's position was really not that well defined. This is how we're supposed to be living. Swami looked at it like that. He closed the book. He said, that's for a higher age. That's not for now. And putting that all together, in a sense, perhaps, and this is a perhaps, Lahiri was laying groundwork for a long time. But as Swami describes us, we're the invading army just hitting the beachhead of materialism, trying to establish, a toehold in a very materialistic world of a higher way of thinking. But the power of all these masters, it's only been 150 years since Lahiri lived. 100 years, about 150 maybe. That's not very long when you think about the slow way that evolution takes place. So, more tomorrow. God bless you.